Hi, I'm Oliver Miao. I lead the team at Pixelberry Studios. Before we get started, I was asked to remind everyone to please put your phone on silent or vibrate mode. We make games for teens, so I don't mind if you're playing a game during my talk, and you can multitask, but just please keep it in silent mode. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how our studio saved a life and how that event inspired us to work with nonprofits to add features to our game that have affected thousands, if not millions, of lives. And hopefully, many of you will leave the room inspired by what we discovered and by the events that we encountered ourselves. But before I begin, I want to get a feel in the room of how many people in the room are actually game developers and make games. Great. It's a large number. Do you remember what it felt like when you first released your very first game? I think it's something that most game developers will always remember. And for me, right after I finished my first game, it was a web-based game that I put on the browser. I showed it to some friends. And it was a really exciting feeling to have them playing that game. And I was also really nervous to see what their response was. But fortunately, they really enjoyed the game. And they actually were inspired to start creating games of their own. And then I launched the game. And suddenly, hundreds and then later thousands of strangers, people I never knew, were playing the game and leaving comments for it. And I think as a game developer, that's something really unique. We're creating something that gets played and seen by all these people who we don't know. Now, my friends kind of caught that same bug. And so later, a few years after college, 4 of us started my first company called CenterScore. We were focused on web-based games. And although we never really talked about it, I think that one of our motivations of starting a game company was so that we could create a project that would be played by millions and millions of people. That was always our intention. And as we began, we actually started creating these multiplayer games that our players really enjoyed. We get emails from people saying, can you change the IP address of your servers? Because our schools won't let us play those games anymore. And we tried to find a financial model. This was in 2000, so we tried to use subscription. It ended up being about 60% of our subscribers paid via PayPal, which was pretty impressive for the time. 30% paid via check, and the other 10% would actually send us dollar bills and in some cases coins. So we had a lot of kids playing our games. But that wasn't enough money for us to sustain our company. So after about a year and a half, we were getting ready to shut our company down. And on the very last day, when we were planning to turn off our servers, we had a friend give us a phone call and ask if we wanted to create cell phone games. So we leapt at that opportunity. And we really tried to learn from the mistakes we had made earlier. And that was we didn't spend enough time on business. We did have some business deals with other companies, but I only spent maybe a quarter of my time on business. And the other founders, they just spent all their time on art and programming and design. And as we started creating games for this one company, it transitioned into creating games for more and more companies. And I went from most of my time on programming to all of my time on business. And I really had to step outside my comfort zone, because I was naturally an introvert. But I go to conferences, just like you are right now, and before a session started, I talked to the person on my right, and I talked to the person on my left, and usually it led to nowhere. But one time, someone on my left was from Sega, and someone on my other side was from Sony, and we actually ended up making games for both those companies. We grew our business, started creating our own games, and after 5 years, we ended up selling that company to Vivendi Games, which owned Blizzard at the time. We were at Blizzard for about 2 years, and then Blizzard and Activision merged, as many of you may know. But Activision didn't want to be in mobile games. So I think we're the only studio that Activision has ever sold to EA, being that they're such fierce competitors. And so I was at EA. And up until then, I was having a lot of fun making games. And it wasn't because of EA that something started changing for me. But something did change. But before I get to that, let me tell you why I loved making games. And some of these reasons may carry over to many of you. First, I just love the creativity of designing a game. You really get a chance to add new ideas, to think about how to do things differently, and see how they affect people. Second, I really loved working as a team with people. It may sound kind of crazy, but in college, I was a pre-med major, and when I decided to change to engineering, I actually told people it was because I wanted to work with people. And you know, doctors see a lot of patients, and they see a lot of people on a daily basis, but they don't get to spend as much time with a core group of people creating something new. And as an engineer, even though I wouldn't see as many people, the relationships I developed with people and creating a project was something that was really appealing to me. And that's definitely a part of gaming that I love. And then the third thing is what I had talked about before. Just seeing something you've created played by millions of people and knowing that they're enjoying your creation just feels really, really good. But something changed. Around the same time that my studio became a part of EA, I had twins, one boy and one girl. And it may sound very cliche, and it's a movie type of moment, and very stereotypical, but having kids really changed how I started thinking about life. It started making me feel like I wanted to do something that would really make a difference so that I could leave the world in a better place for my kids. And although the games we were making, sometimes they did make a difference, and people would tell us that our games would get them through a hard time, or that they really enjoyed what we were doing, I felt like there was more I could do. So I started thinking about other professions, and I explored opportunities in education, in biotech, and in green energy. And the one that seemed that might fit the best was educational gaming. But I had always created games for older kids or teenagers and adults. And in the educational game field, the games that are successful are really the ones geared towards preschoolers or kindergartners, early elementary school. And I think it's because at that age, kids just love being on the iPad, and they'll basically do anything that parents give to them. But once kids start playing on a DS, on a console, on an iPad or iPhone, they start learning that there's a lot of other fun games out there. And educational games aren't as fun anymore, because educational game makers, they focus on education first, and then they try and layer in elements of fun. But as I started thinking more about that, I realized there could be a different model. And that's why I started Pixelberry Studios with two friends. And our model was creating games with heart. And what this meant is that we'd focus on the fun first, really try and make that game successful and played by thousands and millions of people. And then at that point, we'd start layering in elements of education in a way that we hopefully thought would be natural and conducive to the natural gameplay. So, pulled a lot of people that I worked with previously, and we worked on a game for 18 months, and we released High School Story. So High School Story, as you can tell, is a simulation builder-type game where you're creating your dream high school. And we have a story at the beginning that's really focused on a bunch of misfits who don't fit in at their old schools. And they come together to help create this dream school. And you start becoming their leader and working with them. And that story really resonated with our players. So you can see here, for us, story mattered. We had an 87% tutorial completion rate, which is really strong in the mobile games industry. And players were giving us 4.5-star reviews. And most importantly, we had players who would tell us how our game was starting to affect them because of the storyline. You know, this girl, she was from Japan. She had moved over there, didn't have any friends, and didn't feel like she fit in. She said, High School Story opened my eyes to be just myself in front of everybody instead of just fitting in. And messages like this, they really affected our team. You know, they make you feel good about the product you're creating. They might have made us feel like we were headed in the right direction. And because of these messages and the story and all the elements we put into the game, the game started rising quickly up the charts. We hit number 10 in top grossing in the App Store, which was something that not a lot of games can do a week after launch. But we started going back down on the charts because we needed a lot more content. So for 2 months after we launched the game, we were just running like crazy, trying to get as much content in. And we didn't have time, or we may have had time, but we didn't think about the educational aspects of things we could do. Well, 2 months after we launched the game, I was taking a break and surfing the internet, and I read 2 articles in the same afternoon. The first was about a girl, Rebecca Sedgwick. She was from Florida, and she'd been cyberbullied by people in her school over a fight about a boy. And eventually, she couldn't take it anymore, and she committed suicide. The other story was about a girl named Audrey Potts. For those of you here from the Bay Area, she went to a school in Los Gatos, and she went to a house party one day where she got drunk, and she ended up passing out. And when she woke up in a bed with all of her clothes off and Sharpie written all over her. And that's already bad enough. But then the next day when she went to school, she started getting looks from almost everyone in her school. And basically, the kids who had done that had taken pictures of her and started sending messages and photos to everyone else in the school. And she started receiving more messages from people talking about what happened. And she was being cyberbullied. And she felt like she couldn't talk to her parents about it. And she committed suicide as well. And normally when I read these type of stories, it just really bums me out. And it still bums me out even telling you guys about it. But I realized that we actually had a game and a platform where we could start making a difference about this. And their stories really resonated with me because I was bullied when I was growing up. First in elementary school, and then later in junior high. In fact, when I was in junior high, I was a really small 7th grader. And whenever my Spanish teacher was late to class, the biggest 8th grader in the class would pick me up outside the classroom and dangle me over a trash can. And that felt embarrassing, but I could deal with it. But then he'd also put me in a headlock. And sometimes I couldn't tell if he was joking or if he was serious. And it was probably a mix of both. In hindsight, he probably had a lot of other issues that he was just trying to get out himself. But I was really scared. But I never talked to my mom about it. And in fact, she never even found out I had been bullied until I told her about the game and I told her about this particular story. I was just too scared. I thought that if I told my mom, she'd go tell a teacher or principal, and they would do something minor, but not enough, and the bully would take it out on me even more. And I know now in hindsight that I should have talked to someone, to my parents, to a teacher, to an adult. But when you're in middle school, you don't always think about those things. And I started telling this story to people in our studio. And I started finding out that several of them had been bullied too. Some, they had forgotten about it, and some had forgotten about it on purpose. But as we talked about it, we talked about how we could use our game to actually start making a difference there. And so we decided that we would write a cyberbullying storyline so that both victims of cyberbullying as well as people who might be doing the bullying would kind of understand more what was going on, and that we could teach them what to do if they were being bullied. But because this is such a sensitive topic, we really wanted to work with a nonprofit. So we started sending a lot of emails out and started cold calling different nonprofits. And there was no response from anyone. I don't think the nonprofits understood that a game could make a difference. To them, they probably thought games were part of the problem. And then something happened that accelerated things even further. Via our game's in-message support system, a girl messaged us and asked us, should I kill myself? my friends and I at the studio, we didn't know what to do. We were so scared by this. This was totally outside our realm of experience. And when we started a game company, we never thought we'd actually need to be answering a question like this. And of course, the answer is no, but we didn't know what we should tell her. So we ended up calling the suicide prevention hotline ourselves. And they really pushed us to tell the player to get professional help. But we thought if all we were doing was telling her, you should talk to someone, go talk to a psychiatrist or a counselor or a teacher, and that was all we did, that she might feel like we were just pushing her away, and she might not talk to anyone. And if we were at a bigger company, they'd probably tell us, don't talk to her and don't engage in conversation. But we felt a responsibility that we should continue the conversation. So we did tell her to get help, but we also told her that we were there to listen to her. And for a week, and it was the most nerve-wracking week I've ever had, we would exchange messages back and forth with her. And sometimes we might go a day and a half before she messaged back. And during that time, I was really scared that she wasn't going to respond. But then every time we saw a message, I got more scared because she would tell us more about what she was thinking. But finally, after that week and a half, she sent a message to us. And she basically said, I want to thank you for saving me. And she told us that she had finally gotten help. And she followed on by saying, all of you at the studio should know you're the reason I'm still here, as weird as that sounds. And this showed us that games are really, really powerful, right? We're part of an interactive medium that people really connect to. And this girl felt comfortable enough that she could reach out to us. And because we paid attention to her, she was getting help. Now, in the course of helping her, we started doing more research on both cyberbullying and suicide. And we discovered that here in the US, 1 out of 6 teens has been bullied. But what was even scarier than that is that 1 out of 13 teens have actually tried to kill themselves. 1 out of 13. I mean, that number is insane. And so after this incident, we decided we really have to find a nonprofit. So we started trying to cold call people again. Now, as it turns out, the very next day, sorry, I skipped that slide, but the very next day, I had a friend who I had known from the industry. He had just joined a new company called PlayMob, and he got in touch with me. And he basically said, PlayMob connects game developers with nonprofits so that the developers can help the nonprofits raise money, as well as raise awareness for these nonprofits. And he also told me that the week before they contacted us, they had just signed a new nonprofit. And that nonprofit was called the CyberSmile Foundation. And they focus on cyberbullying. And they actually have a helpline with counselors. It was amazing, amazing timing. And we got on the phone with both people at PlayMob as well as CyberSmile, and we quickly hashed out an arrangement. And we decided to do 4 things to our game to really help our players understand cyberbullying better. So the first is we created a cyberbullying quest. And in the quest, we have a girl, Hope, a sister of one of our main characters, who's starting to have problems, but her brother doesn't know what the problems are. And you work with her to discover over time that she's being cyberbullied. And she does some things that you're not supposed to do, like confront the bully directly. But over time, she learns about the things you should do. Some of those things are to always tell an adult, to save a record of the bullying and not delete the messages so that you have proof of what happened, to not retaliate or to talk directly to the bullies, but to hold back. And the second thing we did was we put in-game facts on bullying into our game. The third thing we did is we actually allowed CyberSmile counselors access to our in-game support system. So whenever players would message us for help, CyberSmile counselors could be the ones responding because they had the training. And then lastly, we put CyberSmile-specific items in our game so that players who cared about this could actually buy these items, and a portion of the proceeds would go to CyberSmile. So our goal was to run the campaign for a month, to raise $20,000 and hopefully educate hundreds of thousands of our players. And it turns out that our players loved what we did with this campaign. One player said, "I love these creators. I feel like they actually care about their players and their opinions." And we actually saw the number of people playing our game every day increase by 16% because of this quest. So this is an example of where you can do good and make money at the same time. Our quest was so successful that we decided to keep it in our game for a lot longer than a month. And so since then, we've educated over 5 million players about cyberbullying. We've raised $350,000 for CyberSmile, and we've connected thousands of players to CyberSmile. You know, some of these players were just sharing stories of how they've been bullied, but some of these players were being bullied or were self-hurting. We've had players who've been abused by their parents or concerned about abuse that they've seen with a girlfriend or boyfriend. And some of the players also were thinking about committing suicide. CyberSmile shared some stories. One that really stood out was they were helping a teen who was on the roof of a house, chatting back and forth with them. And by the end of that chat conversation, they had been able to get the parents involved, and the teen had come off the roof, and the parents knew what was going on so that they could find help and talk to their kid about the problem. And we had other people contact us and contact CyberSmile, and we were able to save other lives as well. This was really powerful for our studio, and it inspired people on our team to think up ways in which they could do things with our game to help people as well. We had one designer who decided that he wanted to focus on women in gaming and sexual harassment. And this was about a year before Gamergate. So he wrote a storyline about one of our females in the game who is a gamer and talked about how guys would react to her when she's playing in tournaments. And this was a response from one of our players. One of my favorites is a storyline about sexism and sexual harassment in gaming. From start to finish, it was the ultimate response to gamer discrimination. Two of the females in our studio, our COO and one of our writers, talked about how when they were in high school, they had body image issues. So they reached out to the National Eating Disorders Association, and we partnered with them in creating a storyline about eating disorders and body image. And at the end of that, we gave players a chance who wanted to learn more, an opportunity to discover more details about eating disorders. Our players really responded to this as well. But one thing we learned, even when you're partnering with a nonprofit, they don't always understand how powerful a game can be. So when we first launched our eating disorder storyline, the nonprofit had told us there's specific things in the game you should not include because they may be triggers that cause someone who had an eating disorder before to relapse. And so we pulled those things out. But they didn't realize that just the storyline and the emotional draw from that might be enough to start triggering people. So once we launched it, within that same day, we had a number of players tell us that the story hit too close to home, was a little too traumatic, and we had to push out a message immediately telling our players that, if this is something that you've struggled with, you may want to avoid the quest. And later, we were able to get in a warning message to make sure that players knew before they started the quest that it would be about body image and eating disorder, so they didn't even have to choose it if they wanted to. At the end of this quest, we had over 50,000 players click to learn more about eating disorders. So several months went by, and we finally had time to focus on education. One of the first features we put in our game was called Your Voice Polling. Now, at its roots, it's a very simple feature. Basically, we have a question, and we have answers. And we try and do a mix of different types of questions. A lot of them are just fun and frivolous and focus on movies or memes or trends, or they just ask you, would you rather be stung by 1,000 bees or bitten by a dog? But some of our questions we put in there are about serious topics, like net neutrality, about Syria, about events going on in our world that we think it's important for people to know about. And players can see the type of responses that other people in the game are sharing. And our hope by doing this was that over time, as players started seeing more and more serious topics, that even if they didn't care about the topic at first, the next time they heard someone talking about it, or they caught a glimpse of a headline on a website, they might spend some more time interacting with those topics. And as this one player shows, our players really understood what we were trying to do. And to date, we've had over 50 million questions that have been answered. And the number of sessions since we introduced the feature went up by 12%. And one of our players said, the political questions are only annoying because I end up spending an hour researching them. So the next feature we tried to introduce into the game was extra credit vocabulary. So our thinking behind this was that kids get really stressed out by the SAT. And we actually had a poll question about the SATs asking them about that. And 30% of our players were really stressed by it. The other thing we realized is that there's an income disparity. And for 27% of our players, they could afford prep courses or private tutors. But on average, those courses now cost over $1,000. And so for players who come from a lower economic background and whose parents can't afford those expensive prep courses, we thought our game might be a way to help level the playing field for them. And for everyone, it would be an opportunity for them to learn vocabulary, and if they were in high school, study for the SAT while they're playing our game. And so we really wanted to put game mechanics that would fit this and try and make it as fun as possible. So we learned from a lot of the Sega games out there, like Candy Crush and Cookie Jam and all those other puzzle games. And we used a map, and we created a series of different mini-games. Some of the mini-games were story-based, and they fall very much in line with what we already do with our game. And here, we're trying to teach players what the word potentially can mean just via the context of the game, rather than using a word and a definition. Having them learn in the context of a story should help. And whether they get it wrong or right, eventually they'll learn that verbose means wordy. And then the second type of minigame we have, it's a fast-paced action-style minigame where you're trying to match synonyms or antonyms. And this really reinforces the learning. And we were afraid at first that players might shy away from our game because of the educational aspects. But our players are pretty smart, and they understood what we were trying to do too. And one player gave this as an example of how the feature allowed them to keep playing the game. And we released the SAT functionality in December, so I don't have a ton of data on it so far, but it's been really well received by our players in the forums. And all these type of features are features that, over time, our players feel like we care about them and keep them more and more connected to our game. So in conclusion, I wanted to talk a little bit about the industry and how, especially, how many of you are in the mobile games industry? So in mobile games, and we're starting to see it in other areas of games, we talk about numbers and data all the time, right? We talk about day 1 retention, day 30 retention, ARPDAU, DAU, MAU. And when we use these numbers, we think about our players not as people, but as whales, as people we can make money from, or people who can download and play our games. But the things that have happened with our game have taught me that each one of our players is an individual. And it's something that we all should know about, but we don't think about a lot. And my hope is that from this talk, that if just a few of you start thinking about how in your jobs you can use your game to start making a difference, that more and more games can take the mechanics we've done and the ways in which we're already engaging players, and we can use that to help create games that have more and more of a social impact. And as those games become more and more successful, bigger companies will take notice. And eventually, I hope that games are associated both with entertainment, but also with making a difference, and that we remember that all of our players are people too. Thank you. So if you have any questions, feel free to go up to the microphone. I can talk about either events that happened within the game or elucidate more on some of those things, or I can just answer questions about our game or things we did to make our game more successful.
Hi. I was just wondering if, first off, I think this experiment, taking a really successful game and trying to make it educational is awesome. And I was wondering if you had any stories of like, say, failures that we might also learn from when it comes to like making a feature that's more educational, or making a feature that integrates with, or that hooks up with a nonprofit or something like that.
Right. The best example was probably the one I shared, where we didn't even realize how powerful the message would be, and we had to scramble at the last minute. Some of those players who had eating disorders and started playing those quests, they were guessing that something was coming like that, but you could really see kind of their angst and their anxiety once we started triggering that. And so we felt really, really, really bad about that. And I think one of the things we've learned over time with High School Story, we release new quests every week, and we've learned that having downloadable systems and basically online systems so that you can adjust things and change things and add messages is super, super helpful. Because inevitably, if you're dropping new content at that type of pace, you're always going to have problems.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, I was wondering if you know the demographics of your game. Do you tend to have more like female or male players?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. So she asked about the demographics for our game. So the large majority of our players, we believe, are teen females. When we look at Facebook Connect, it says the number 1 group is 18 to 24, and then the number 2 group is 14 to 18. But we think Facebook's reliability, especially when it comes to people under 18, isn't always the most reliable. And looking at our forums and everything, we think our core audience is probably 14 to 18 females. And when it comes to females versus males, about 85% of our players are females now. I do think that's changed over time. When we first launched, it was much more gender neutral. But over time, because of all the advertising and targeting we've done, we've pulled in more and more females into the game.
So was that a purposeful choice, or did it just happen?
I would say it was a purposeful choice to pursue the advertising that was most effective, right? So in the mobile games industry, most mobile game companies will spend a lot of money on what we call user acquisition, right? And so you want to do the most effective user acquisition you can. And for us, the ads that started working the best were ones that appealed towards females.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Inspiring talk, sir. Have you had any further contact with the young one whose life you saved?
We actually haven't had any contact with her since. So the question is if we had any contact with the young woman since. And one of the things that's our policy is already when we're talking back to our players, and it's not about game-related issues, but deeper or social issues like this. We have never talked to our lawyers about this. So one of the first things we started thinking about when we got this message, and we thought about whether we should reply back or not, someone in the studio actually brought up, legally, are we even allowed to talk to these people? And excuse me, we decided that even if we weren't sure if we were allowed to talk to them about this, especially if they may be underage, so we made a point not to ask about her age, we wanted to engage with her. But after that point, when we knew she was getting help, we never wanted to be the one to initiate a conversation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello. I'm wondering what your thoughts on the game being a value-based game, but also wanting the company, obviously, to be profitable in the long run. Do you feel like you have to make sacrifices on either side, and how do you have that balance?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. He's asking about, because we're a value-based company, but we're also trying to make money, if we've run into conflicts related to that. And we haven't, and the main reason is because we set as our guiding light, the first thing we want to try and do is have commercial success. And so, when we're designing our games, right, we're always thinking about what type of features are really going to be fun and entertaining for our players first. And then only after that point do we start thinking about these other features. And as you can tell, a lot of those features, like some of them definitely tend more educational, but what we've seen in most cases is that it's actually improved our game and helped with retention or with engagement from our players. But I'm sure at some point that may come up. And I guess as I think about it, even when we decide whether we should answer back to that girl or not, one of the other questions we had was, what happens if we engage with her and we say the wrong thing, and she does end up killing herself, and her parents find out that we were talking to her during that process, right? And we get sued. And so from that perspective, and that's why I think a lot of big companies would not be engaged in those type of conversations, and they would tell you just to stop communicating. So in that case, I guess we do put our company at the risk sometimes when we do this, but for us, it's worth it. And it really makes a difference in your studio when you're starting to do things like this, because everyone on our team, we all love making games, but now we actually feel like what we're doing has more of an impact. So even when we talk to our parents and our friends about it, it's something that they all really get. And I think it gives us kind of an extra push in what we do.
Yeah, I also agree. This was a great talk. Do you have any counselors on staff?
No, we don't have counselors ourselves. That's one of the reasons we partnered with the nonprofits, so that when we get those questions, we redirect them to CyberSmile, so they do have counselors there. We have had people on our staff get more educated about this, and we've actually thought about in the past putting some of our support staff through training so that they'd be able to help more. But it's a lot easier and makes a lot more sense for us to just have them talk to someone who's at a trained nonprofit.
Hi, sorry, quick question. Just because you've seen a good amount of success from implementing these features into high school story, do you guys feel inspired to just create new games that are really geared towards social good as the main feature? Right,
so the question was, because of High School Story and the success we've seen, for our next games, do we think a lot about creating games that focus on social good? And The direct answer I'd say to that is no. Because we still think about what's going to be most successful in the marketplace. Because if you're trying to create a game for just social good, you may not reach as many people because not as many people are going to play that game, right? So we're always thinking about how we can create a game where we can make enough money to support our studio, hopefully more so we can keep growing the studio, but at the same time reach more and more people. So when we spend money on advertising, a lot of companies will spend money to make sure that they're always making a profit off those ads. Sometimes we push the limit, and we spend as much money as we think we're going to make from players who come in through those ads. And it's because of that kind of social message, too. But as an example, for our second game we released, it's called Hollywood U, which on its surface, doesn't feel like it has much to do with social good at all. And right now, our storyline, we still try and keep it to the values that we believe in, and we try and promote, inclusion and people being themselves in our story. But we don't have these elements of working with nonprofits or doing things. But we definitely have thought about those features, and over the next few months, we'll start rolling in those type of storylines. One of the great things about Hollywood is, celebrities actually, a lot of them work with different nonprofits. So as part of the game, after you start becoming a little more famous and connected within the game, you'll have the opportunity to choose among different nonprofits to work with and to see which one you want to support. And in doing so, we're hoping we can educate players about those particular causes. Any other questions? Great, thank you. And I hope some of you leave inspired and are able to make a difference with your games as well. Thank you.